I'm Amanda, and I still remember the exact moment I realized my sister-in-law had stolen my entire divorce settlement. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a bank statement that showed a balance of $37 when there should have been $850,000. The coffee mug in my other hand slipped, shattering against the tile floor. But I didn't even flinch, because what Vanessa didn't know was that my father had been watching her every move for months, and the phone call he was about to make to her financial advisor would destroy everything she thought she'd built on my stolen dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, rain drummed against the windows of the downtown law office where my divorce was finally being finalized. After 3 years of legal battles with Derek, I thought the worst was behind me. The settlement we'd agreed on wasn't just money to me. It was my freedom, my chance to start over, to maybe open the art studio I'd dreamed about since college, but had abandoned when Derek convinced me that practical wives didn't chase fantasies. My lawyer, Catherine Park, slid the final papers across her mahogany desk. Her office smelled like vanilla candles and fresh printer ink, a combination that should have been comforting, but instead made my stomach twist with nervous energy. $850,000, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a hard-won victory. Plus the Portland house, of course. Derek's business assets were more substantial than he initially disclosed. I signed my name with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief of finally being free. 3 years of marriage to a man who'd systematically chipped away at my confidence, who'd convinced me that my art was just an expensive hobby, who'd made me feel small in 1,000 tiny ways. It was finally over. Vanessa had insisted on being there for moral support, which should have been my first red flag. Derek's sister had always been overly involved in our marriage, showing up unannounced with opinions about everything from my cooking to my career choices. But during the divorce proceedings, she'd suddenly become my champion, offering shoulders to cry on and endless cups of tea while assuring me that Derek was the problem, not me. "You deserve every penny," she said as we walked to my car after the meeting, her designer heels clicking against the wet pavement. "After what he put you through, this is just karma finally catching up." Her smile was warm, sympathetic. "Everything you'd want from family during a crisis. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself." The settlement money was supposed to be transferred within 5 business days. Vanessa offered to help me set up new bank accounts, claiming she had experience with large financial transfers from her work in real estate. Looking back, I should have questioned why someone who sold condos would know about divorce settlements, but I was emotionally drained and grateful for any help. She drove me to 3 different banks that week, sitting beside me as I opened accounts and signed paperwork. Her presence was reassuring. She asked all the right questions, took notes, even brought me tissues when the stress of it all made me tear up in the Bank of America lobby. "Fresh starts require fresh accounts," she said, squeezing my hand. "We're going to make sure every trace of Derek is gone from your finances." The first account was for daily expenses, the second for long-term savings, and the third, the one that would hold the bulk of the settlement, was what she called my dream fund. "This is for your art studio," she explained as we sat in the sterile waiting area at Chase Bank. "Keep it separate so you're never tempted to dip into it for mundane things. This money represents your future." I was so focused on the excitement of financial independence that I didn't notice how carefully she photographed every document with her phone, claiming she wanted to help me organize everything in a spreadsheet later. I didn't question why she insisted on being present when I met with the bank manager to set up the wire transfer instruction. I didn't even think twice when she suggested using her home address as a backup contact for account security, just in case something happens to your apartment during the move. The transfer was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent that weekend in a fog of possibility, browsing real estate listings for studio spaces, sketching out business plans on napkins, feeling more alive than I had in years. My art supplies, boxed up in the closet for so long they'd gathered dust, suddenly seemed to pulse with potential again. Tuesday arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that usually matched my mood perfectly. But that day, I felt untouchable. I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for the notification that the wire transfer had completed. By 3 in the afternoon, I couldn't stand the suspense anymore and drove to the Chase branch where we'd set up the account. Marcus, The bank manager who'd helped us the previous week greeted me with a professional smile. "Ms. Reynolds, hear about your transfer." When I nodded eagerly, his expression shifted to something more cautious. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. The funds were transferred this morning, but then immediately moved again, under your authorization." My chest felt tight. He pulled up my account on his computer screen, squinting at the information displayed there. "According to our records, you initiated a transfer to an investment account at Merrill Lynch. The authorization came through your registered contact, and all the security questions were answered correctly." The world tilted sideways. "I didn't authorize any transfer. I don't have an account at Merrill Lynch." Marcus's face went pale. "Ma'am, I think we need to involve our fraud department immediately." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and increasing panic. The bank's fraud investigator, a thin woman named Janet with kind eyes, walked me through every transaction step by step. The authorization had come from Vanessa's phone number, the backup contact number I'd stupidly agreed to add for security purposes. Someone with access to all my personal information had called, provided the correct security answers, and requested the transfer, claiming I was traveling and needed the funds moved urgently. "The good news is that we can trace where the money went," Janet assured me as I sat in her office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the water cup she'd brought me. "The bad news is that investment accounts are harder to freeze than standard checking accounts. We'll need to involve law enforcement." I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process the betrayal. Vanessa had been with me every step of the way. She'd held my hand through bank meetings, celebrated my victory over Derek, promised to help me build my new life, and she'd been planning to steal everything from the very beginning. My apartment felt different when I walked in, like the air itself had thickened with the weight of what I'd lost. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, knowing I needed to call someone but not sure who. The police felt too official, too final. Catherine, my lawyer, would want to start legal proceedings immediately. My father, I couldn't bear to tell him how naive I'd been, how completely I'd been manipulated by someone I'd trusted. Instead, I found myself scrolling through my contact list until I reached Vanessa's name. My finger hovered over the call button for several minutes before I finally pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before her familiar voice answered. "Amanda, how are you feeling? I've been thinking about you all day. Did the transfer go through okay?" Her tone was perfect, concerned, caring, completely innocent. If I hadn't just spent 3 hours with bank investigators, I might have believed she genuinely didn't know what had happened. "Vanessa," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "the money's gone. Someone transferred it to an investment account without my permission." The pause that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. "Oh my God, that's terrible. How is that even possible? Banks are supposed to be secure." "Do you think Derek somehow?" "The authorization came from your phone number." Another pause, this one longer. When she spoke again, her voice carried a slight tremor. "That's impossible. I've been in client meetings all day. Maybe someone spoofed my number. I've heard that's a thing now with these phone scams." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was going to lie to my face. The person who called knew my social security number, my mother's maiden name, the name of my first pet. They knew everything. "Vanessa." "Amanda, you're scaring me. Are you suggesting that I would steal from you? After everything we've been through together, after how hard I've worked to help you get away from my brother?" The hurt in her voice was so convincing that for a moment, I almost doubted myself. But then I remembered Marcus's computer screen, the cold facts of transaction records and phone logs. "I trusted you," I whispered. "You can still trust me," she said quickly. "Let me help you figure this out. These scammers are getting so sophisticated. We'll call the bank together. I hung up without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while I stared at the wall, trying to make sense of what had happened. $850,000 gone. My art studio, my fresh start, my independence, all of it evaporated, because I'd been foolish enough to trust family. The worst part wasn't even the money, though losing it felt like losing a limb. The worst part was the betrayal itself. Vanessa had watched me cry over Derek's emotional abuse. She'd held me while I talked about feeling worthless, about how he'd convinced me that my dreams were selfish fantasies. She'd encouraged me to fight for a fair settlement, had celebrated with me when Catherine negotiated such a substantial amount, and through it all, she'd been planning to take everything for herself. I thought about calling my father. Robert Chen had built his tech company from nothing, turning a small software development firm into a major player in the Portland business scene. He understood money, understood business, understood people who tried to take advantage of others, but admitting what had happened meant admitting how completely I'd failed to protect myself. After years of Derek making me feel incompetent, the thought of disappointing my father too was unbearable. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching investment fraud, wire transfer reversals, criminal charges for financial theft. The legal landscape was complex and intimidating, full of terms I didn't understand, and processes that could take years to resolve. Even if I could prove Vanessa had stolen the money, getting it back might be nearly impossible. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Vanessa. "I couldn't sleep knowing you think I'd hurt you. Can we meet tomorrow? I want to help you get your money back. Family sticks together." I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone aside without responding. Family sticks together. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. The next morning brought gray skies and the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything in Portland look washed out and tired. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror showed it. Dark circles under my eyes, skin pale and drawn, hair that refused to cooperate no matter how much I brushed it. I looked like a victim, and the thought made my jaw clench with determination. Catherine's office felt different this time. The vanilla candles and professional atmosphere that had seemed so reassuring during the divorce proceedings now felt almost mocking. How could I have been so careful about protecting myself from Derek only to hand everything over to his sister without a second thought? "Investment fraud is a federal crime," Catherine explained, as she reviewed the bank documentation I'd brought. "The FBI has entire departments dedicated to this type of theft, but recovery can be complicated, especially if the funds have been moved multiple times or converted to other assets." I sat across from her desk, trying to focus on her words while my mind kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Vanessa over the past month. Had there been signs I'd missed, moments when her mask had slipped? How long does this usually take to resolve? Months, potentially years, and that's assuming we can prove criminal intent rather than just gross negligence. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression sympathetic but realistic. "Amanda, I have to ask, did you give Vanessa any written authorization to act on your behalf? Any power of attorney documents, even temporary ones?" "No, nothing like that. She was just helping me navigate the banking process. I never gave her permission to touch my money." "Good. That makes this a clear case of fraud rather than a dispute over authorized transaction." Catherine made notes on her yellow legal pad, her pen scratching against the paper in the quiet office. "I'll file a police report today and contact the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. But Amanda, I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that even if we win, recovery might not be complete." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean? Investment fraud cases are complex. If Vanessa has moved the money through multiple accounts, purchased assets, or transferred funds overseas, tracing and recovering everything becomes exponentially more difficult. Courts can order restitution, but collecting on those orders is a separate challenge entirely." I left Catherine's office feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The legal system that had helped me divorce Derek suddenly seemed inadequate to handle this new crisis. Filing reports and waiting for investigations felt passive, helpless. I needed something more immediate, more decisive. My phone rang as I was walking to my car. Unknown number, which I'd been avoiding since news of the theft had somehow leaked to local reporters. But something made me answer this time. "Amanda, this is Helen Torres, your father's assistant. Mr. Chen would like to see you this afternoon if you're available. He said it's regarding a family matter that requires immediate attention." My stomach dropped. Somehow my father had found out about the theft, which meant I was about to face the conversation I'd been dreading most. Explaining to one of Portland's most successful businessmen how his daughter had been completely swindled by her ex-sister-in-law. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 o'clock, if that works for you. And Amanda, he asked me to tell you not to worry. He said everything's going to be fine. I spent the drive to my father's office building rehearsing explanations, trying to find words that would make my naivety sound less catastrophic. The Chen Technologies building rose 30 stories into the Portland skyline, its glass facade reflecting the gray clouds that seemed permanently fixed over the city. I'd been here countless times growing up, but today the lobby's marble floors and contemporary art installations felt intimidating rather than familiar. Helen greeted me with a warm smile that did nothing to calm my nerves. He's waiting in his office, she said, guiding me toward the executive elevator. And Amanda, you're going to be okay. Your father has been making some very interesting phone calls this morning. The elevator ride to the 30th floor felt eternal. When the doors opened, I could see my father through his office's glass walls, standing behind his desk with his phone pressed to his ear. He gestured for me to come in, but continued his conversation while I settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Marcus, I appreciate your cooperation in this matter, he was saying, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him successful in business. Yes, I understand the privacy concerns, but we're talking about fraud perpetrated against my daughter using accounts at your institution. The documentation I'm sending over should clarify any legal questions. He hung up and turned his full attention to me, his expression mixing parental concern with the focused intensity he brought to business challenges. Amanda, he said simply, tell me everything. So I did. Every detail, from the initial divorce settlement, to Vanessa's helpful presence at bank meetings, to yesterday's devastating discovery. My father listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the pad beside his computer, his face revealing nothing about his thoughts. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then he opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. I've been doing some research on your sister-in-law, he said, Vanessa Reynolds, age 34, currently employed by Pacific Northwest Realty. But what's interesting is her financial advisor. The screen showed a professional LinkedIn profile, Marcus Williams, Senior Investment Advisor at Merrill Lynch, Portland. I've known Marcus for 15 years, my father continued. His firm handles some of our corporate investment. We've done business together, attended the same charity events, played golf at the same country club. He's a smart man, Amanda, but he's also ambitious, sometimes too ambitious. I stared at the profile photo. A middle-aged man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit, the kind of person who looked trustworthy and successful. You think he's involved? I think Marcus Williams is about to have a very uncomfortable conversation about his client's recent investment activity.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My father's smile was cold, predatory. Because here's what Vanessa didn't consider when she chose to steal from you. She chose to steal from Robert Chen's daughter. And Robert Chen has resources she can't even imagine. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Through bleary eyes, I saw Helen's name on the screen and immediately felt my pulse quicken. It was barely 7 in the morning, far too early for a routine call from my father's office. Amanda, I need you to come in immediately. Helen's voice was crisp, professional, but I caught an undercurrent of excitement. Your father has been up since 4 making phone calls. He's scheduled a meeting with Marcus Williams for 9:30, and he wants you there. I sat up in bed, my mind still foggy from the few hours of restless sleep I'd managed. A meeting? Marcus agreed to meet with us? Let's just say your father can be very persuasive when he wants to be. Wear something professional. We're going to his office, not ours. And Amanda, bring copies of all your banking documents. Every single piece of paper related to the account setup and the theft. I showered and dressed in a navy blazer and matching pants, the kind of outfit I used to wear to client meetings back when I had a career instead of just survival instincts. My hands shook slightly as I applied makeup, trying to cover the exhaustion that had settled into my features like a permanent shadow. In the mirror, I looked like someone pretending to be competent, which wasn't far from the truth. The drive through downtown Portland felt surreal. Morning commuters hurried along sidewalks clutching coffee cups, their faces focused on the ordinary concerns of ordinary days. I envied them their simple problems. Traffic jams and deadline stress seemed manageable compared to having your entire future stolen by someone you'd trusted with your deepest vulnerability. My father was waiting in the lobby of the Merrill Lynch building when I arrived, dressed in one of his signature charcoal suits that somehow managed to look both expensive and understated. His presence commanded attention even in a room full of financial professionals, and I watched several people glance in his direction with the kind of recognition reserved for local celebrities. "Ready for this?" he asked, his voice low and reassuring as we walked toward the elevator bank. "I don't even know what this is," I admitted. "What exactly are we doing here?" "We're going to have a conversation about professional ethics and the consequences of enabling fraud." The elevator doors opened, and he gestured for me to step inside. Marcus Williams has built his career on discretion and maintaining client relationships. What he hasn't considered is what happens when those relationships conflict with basic human decency. The Merrill Lynch offices occupied 3 floors of the building, their reception area decorated with the kind of modern art and leather furniture designed to communicate success and stability. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that looked practiced, greeted us with professional warmth. "Mr. Chen, Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Williams is expecting you. Conference room C just down the hall." Marcus Williams rose from his seat as we entered the conference room, extending his hand with the confident smile of someone accustomed to managing wealthy clients. He was exactly what I'd expected from his LinkedIn photo, mid-40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished presence that suggested success without ostentation. But I noticed something else in his expression when he looked at me, a flicker of discomfort, quickly suppressed. "Robert, good to see you again," he said, shaking my father's hand before turning to me. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I understand you've experienced some difficulties with your recent financial transfers." Difficult, as if having my life savings stolen was comparable to a minor accounting error. I forced myself to smile politely as I shook his hand, noting how his palm felt slightly damp despite the office's air conditioning. "Marcus," my father said, settling into his chair with the kind of casual authority that somehow made the entire room feel smaller. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us on such short notice. I know how busy your schedule must be, especially with some of your demanding clients." Something passed between them in that moment, a subtle shift in the room's dynamics that I didn't fully understand but could definitely feel. Marcus's smile became more forced and he cleared his throat before responding. "Of course, Robert. Anything I can do to help clarify the situation, though I should mention up front that client confidentiality limits what I can discuss about specific accounts or transactions." "Naturally," my father agreed, opening the folder he'd brought and sliding a document across the table. "That's why I thought you might be interested in reviewing this police report that Amanda filed yesterday. It outlines the unauthorized transfer of $850,000 from her Chase bank account to an investment account under your management." Marcus picked up the document, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and detailed transaction information. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "I see, and you believe this transfer was unauthorized?" "I know it was unauthorized," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I never gave permission for my divorce settlement to be moved to any investment account. The only person with access to my account information was my ex-sister-in-law, Vanessa Reynolds." Yes, Miss Reynolds." Marcus set the document down and folded his hands on the table. "She is indeed a client of mine. Has been for several years. Very sophisticated investor, quite knowledgeable about market strategies and portfolio diversification." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "Very sophisticated investor. With my money. So you're admitting that Vanessa brought my divorce settlement to you as an investment?" "I'm saying that a client brought funds for investment. Yes, but Amanda, may I call you Amanda? You have to understand that my obligation is to verify the legitimacy of funds and the authority of the person making the investment, not to investigate the source of every dollar that comes through our door." My father leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining conversational but carrying an edge that I recognized from tense business negotiations. "Marcus, help me understand your verification process. When someone brings you nearly $1 million to invest, What steps do you take to ensure they have legal authority to make that investment? Well, we require proper identification, proof of income, verification that the funds aren't proceeds from illegal activities, the standard due diligence that's required by federal law. And in Vanessa's case, Marcus hesitated for just a moment, and in that brief pause I saw something crack in his professional facade. She provided all required documentation. The funds came from a legitimate bank transfer. All paperwork was in order. Paperwork indicating that she was the rightful owner of those funds. Another hesitation, longer this time. The paperwork indicated that she had legal authority to invest those funds on behalf of the beneficial owner. The words hit me like a physical blow. She told you she was investing my money on my behalf. She indicated that she was acting as a financial representative for a family member going through a difficult divorce. It's not uncommon for people to have trusted relatives handle their investments during times of personal crisis. I stared at him, trying to process the casual way he described the theft of my entire future. Did you verify that she actually had permission to act as my financial representative? Did you contact me? Did you ask for documentation proving she had power of attorney? Marcus's face had gone slightly pale, and he glanced at my father before responding. The funds transfer was legitimate, the account was properly established, and Ms. Reynolds provided assurances that all necessary permissions were in place. Assurances, my father repeated, his tone flat. Not documentation, not verification. Assurances. Robert, you know as well as I do that financial services operate on trust and established relationships. Vanessa Reynolds has been a client for years. She's brought us substantial business, and she's never given us any reason to doubt her integrity. Until now, I said quietly. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Marcus shifted in his chair, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, clearly struggling with something he didn't want to say. Finally, he looked directly at me. Amanda, I want you to understand that if there's been any impropriety here, it wasn't intentional on our part. We believed we were handling a legitimate investment on behalf of someone who couldn't manage it themselves due to personal circumstances. What personal circumstances? I asked. What exactly did Vanessa tell you about me? Marcus glanced at my father again, as if asking permission to continue. She said you were going through a difficult divorce, that you were emotionally unstable and making poor financial decisions. She was concerned that you might spend the settlement money irresponsibly and wanted to ensure it was properly invested for your long-term security. The words felt like a slap across the face. Emotionally unstable, poor financial decisions, irresponsible. Even in theft, Vanessa had managed to make me the problem, painting herself as the responsible family member protecting me from my own incompetence. So you took the word of someone who wasn't even my immediate family that I was too mentally unstable to manage my own divorce settlement. Amanda, please understand. No, I interrupted, standing up from my chair. You understand. My ex-husband spent 3 years convincing me that I was incapable of making good decisions. He made me doubt my own judgment, my own intelligence, my own worth. And when I finally broke free from that and won a settlement that represented my independence, my fresh start, my chance to rebuild my life, his sister continued that same manipulation with you as her accomplice. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable now, his professional composure cracking under the weight of what he was hearing. If Ms. Reynolds misrepresented the situation, she stole from me, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. And you helped her do it because it was easier to believe that a woman going through divorce was crazy than to do your due diligence and verify her authority to access someone else's money. My father had remained silent through this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him successful in business. Marcus, I think we need to discuss the practical implications of this situation. What do you mean? I mean that my daughter has been the victim of investment fraud, facilitated by your firm's negligent verification processes. The money needs to be returned immediately, and we need to discuss how we're going to handle the regulatory and legal consequences of this situation. Marcus's face went completely white. Robert, surely we can work something out here. If there's been a misunderstanding, there's been a crime, my father corrected. Amanda has filed a police report. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is launching an investigation. And unless my daughter's money is returned immediately, Chen Technologies will be reevaluating all of our business relationships with firms that demonstrate this level of professional negligence. The threat hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Chen Technologies represented millions of dollars in annual business for investment firms throughout Portland. Losing that relationship would be devastating for Marcus's career, and everyone in the room knew it. The situation is complicated, Marcus said carefully. The funds have been invested across multiple portfolios. Liquidating those investments immediately would result in significant losses, penalties for early withdrawal. How much? My father asked. I'm sorry. How much would Amanda lose if you liquidated everything today and returned her money? Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what I assumed were account details. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, and I could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Despite the office's cool temperature, current market conditions, early withdrawal penalties, liquidation costs, he muttered, apparently calculating as he spoke. Roughly $60,000 to $70,000 in fees and losses. The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. $70,000? Market volatility has been high recently, and some of the investments were structured with penalty clauses for early withdrawal. But Amanda, if we wait 6 months, maybe a year, those penalties would disappear and the market position might recover. She doesn't have 6 months, my father interrupted. She doesn't have 6 weeks. The money was stolen, Marcus. Every day it remains in those accounts is another day you're profiting from the proceeds of a crime. Marcus set his phone down and looked directly at my father. Robert, what exactly are you asking me to do here? I'm asking you to make this right. Today, liquidate the investments, absorb the penalties and losses yourself, and return my daughter's money to her legitimate account. Consider it the cost of doing business with criminals. The firm can't absorb $70,000 in losses without documentation proving negligence on our part. Then I guess you'd better start working on that documentation, my father said, standing up from his chair. Because the alternative is having this conversation with federal investigators, regulatory authorities, and probably a jury. I watched this exchange feeling like a spectator at my own life. 2 powerful men negotiating the terms of my financial recovery, while I sat there wondering if I'd ever feel like more than a victim of other people's decisions. But then my father looked at me and I saw something in his expression that I'd been missing. Not pity, not disappointment, but respect for my strength in surviving this betrayal. Amanda, Marcus said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I want you to know that if I had understood the true nature of this situation, I would never have processed those investments. Vanessa presented very convincing documentation and seemed genuinely concerned about your welfare. What kind of documentation? He hesitated, then pulled a folder from his briefcase. Medical records suggesting you were under psychiatric care for depression and anxiety following your divorce. A letter supposedly from your therapist recommending that your finances be managed by a trusted family member until you achieved better emotional stability. The room went completely silent. I stared at Marcus, trying to process what he'd just said. Medical records, a letter from my therapist, all professionally formatted, properly letterheaded. Very convincing. I have copies if you'd like to see them. He slid several documents across the table and I picked them up with trembling hands. The letterhead was from Portland Mental Health Associates, a real clinic I'd never visited. The doctor's name was someone I'd never heard of, but the patient information was mine. My full name, my address, my date of birth, even my insurance information. The medical summary described severe depression, anxiety, and what the report called financial decision-making impairment, related to emotional trauma. The therapist's letter recommended that I be protected from making major financial decisions until I completed at least 6 months of intensive therapy. These are completely fabricated, I whispered, staring at documents that looked official but described a version of myself I didn't recognize. I've never been to this clinic, never seen this doctor, never had any of these treatments. Marcus's face had gone ashen. Amanda, I'm so sorry. The documents looked completely legitimate. We had no reason to doubt. You had every reason to doubt, I interrupted, my voice growing stronger as my anger built. You had every reason to contact me directly before allowing someone else to control my money based on forged medical records. You had every reason to verify that the person claiming to act on my behalf actually had legal authority to do so. My father reached across the table and picked up the forged documents, studying them with the focused attention he brought to business contracts. "These are very sophisticated forgeries," he said after a moment. "Professional quality letterhead, convincing medical terminology, even what appears to be a legitimate doctor's signature. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned and executed with significant preparation." The implications of what he was saying settled over me like a cold fog. This wasn't just theft, it was identity fraud, medical document forgery, and a level of premeditation that made Vanessa's betrayal even more devastating. She hadn't just stolen my money on impulse, she'd spent time and effort creating an entire false narrative about my mental health to justify taking control of my finances.
How long ago did she bring you these documents? I asked Marcus. He checked his files, flipping through several pages, before finding what he was looking for. The initial consultation was about 6 weeks ago. She said she'd been concerned about your stability since the divorce proceedings began, and wanted to have everything in place to protect you when the settlement came through. 6 weeks ago, while she was sitting in my living room drinking tea and letting me cry on her shoulder about Derek's emotional abuse, she was already planning to steal my divorce settlement and had forged medical records to justify it. The level of calculation and cruelty took my breath away. "Marcus," my father said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that usually preceded major business decisions, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. My daughter is going to walk out of here today with a cashier's check for $850,000. You're going to absorb any losses, penalties, or fees associated with liquidating those investments immediately, and you're going to provide us with copies of every document Vanessa Reynolds gave you, along with detailed records of all transactions related to Amanda's money." "Robert, I don't have the authority to authorize that kind of loss without board approval." "Then you'd better get that approval very quickly," my father interrupted, "because the alternative is explaining to your board why the firm is facing federal charges for investment fraud, why Chen Technologies is terminating all business relationships with you, and why your name is going to be in every financial trade publication in the country as the advisor who helped steal a divorce settlement based on forged medical records." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the conference table. When he finally looked up, his face had the resigned expression of someone who'd just realized they'd lost a game they didn't even know they were playing. "I'll need about 2 hours to liquidate the positions and prepare the check," he said quietly. "And I'll personally cover any losses to ensure Amanda receives the full amount." "Good," my father said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "We'll be back at 2 o'clock. And Mark, if you contact Vanessa Reynolds or anyone else about this conversation, our agreement is off and you'll be dealing with federal investigators instead of me." As we walked out of the Merrill Lynch building, I felt like I was floating somewhere outside my own body. 2 hours ago, I'd been convinced that recovering my money would take months or years of legal battles. Now, my father had somehow managed to negotiate its return in a single conversation. "How did you do that?" I asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside the building, watching Portland's usual parade of business professionals hurry past with their coffee cups and focused expressions. "Marcus Williams is ambitious and smart, but he's also risk-averse," my father explained. Once he understood that helping Vanessa could destroy his career, the choice became obvious. Sometimes the most effective negotiation tactic is simply making sure the other party understands the true cost of their decisions. I nodded, but something else was bothering me. "Dad, those forged medical records, how did Vanessa get my personal information? My insurance details, my address, everything in those files was accurate except for the medical history itself." My father's expression darkened. "That's a very good question, and it's one we're going to get answered." We spent the next 2 hours at a quiet coffee shop downtown, but I couldn't taste the latte I'd ordered or focus on the newspaper my father was reading. My mind kept circling back to those forged medical records, the precise details about my life that had been twisted into a weapon against me. The insurance information bothered me most. That wasn't something you could find on social media or piece together from casual conversation. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Amanda, I heard about the confusion with your money. We need to talk. This isn't what I wanted." I showed the message to my father, who glanced at it and shook his head. She knows you're onto her. Probably got a call from Marcus or someone at the investment firm asking uncomfortable questions. Should I respond? Not yet. Let her wonder what you know and when you're going to act on it. Uncertainty is often more powerful than direct confrontation. At exactly 2 o'clock, we returned to the Merrill Lynch building. This time, Marcus was waiting for us in the lobby, holding a leather portfolio and looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The confident professional demeanor from our morning meeting had been replaced by nervous energy and frequent glances toward the elevator, as if he expected federal agents to emerge at any moment. "Everything's ready," he said without preamble, guiding us toward a smaller conference room near the back of the office. "I've liquidated all positions and absorbed the losses personally. The total comes to $850,000 exactly." He opened the portfolio and slid a cashier's check across the table. Seeing my name printed next to that amount of money felt surreal after everything that had happened. Just 48 hours ago, I'd been staring at a bank balance of $37, wondering if I'd ever recover from Vanessa's betrayal. "And the documentation?" my father asked. Marcus handed over a thick folder containing what appeared to be every piece of paper related to my stolen money. Copies of all the forged documents Vanessa provided, transaction records, account statements, even recordings of our phone conversations, where she discussed your supposed mental health issues. "Recordings?" I looked up sharply. "You recorded your conversations with her." "Standard practice for investment accounts over $500,000. Compliance requirement." Marcus's voice was flat, professional. "You'll find them very enlightening. She was quite detailed about your alleged psychological condition and your family's concerns about your decision-making capacity." I felt sick imagining Vanessa sitting in this same conference room spinning elaborate lies about my mental state to justify stealing my future. "Can I hear them?" Marcus glanced at my father, who nodded. He pulled out a digital recorder and pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled the small room, clear and confident. "I'm really worried about Amanda's state of mind, Marcus. The divorce has been so traumatic for her, and frankly the family is concerned about what she might do with such a large sum of money. She's been talking about some unrealistic art studio fantasy, throwing away her financial security on a pipe dream that will never work." My hands clenched into fists as I listened to her casual dismissal of my dreams, the same dreams she'd encouraged to my face while secretly undermining them behind my back. The recording continued. "Her therapist thinks she needs at least 6 months of intensive treatment before she should be making any major financial decisions. I know it seems like I'm overstepping, but someone needs to protect her from herself right now." Marcus stopped the recording. "There are 3 more conversations like that, each one reinforcing the narrative that you were mentally unstable and needed financial protection." She was very convincing, because she knew exactly what to say. I realized, my voice hollow. She knew about my dreams for the art studio because I'd confided in her. She knew about my struggles with self-doubt because I'd shared my deepest insecurities with her. She turned my own vulnerabilities into weapons. My father reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Amanda, what Vanessa did wasn't just theft. It was psychological warfare designed to make you doubt your own judgment and capabilities. That level of manipulation takes planning and a complete absence of conscience." We left the Merrill Lynch building with the cashier's check safely tucked into my purse and a folder full of evidence that would destroy Vanessa's life if she forced us to use it. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt hollow. Getting my money back was just the beginning. I still had to figure out how to rebuild trust in my own judgment after being so thoroughly deceived by someone I'd considered family. "Where to now?" my father asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside the building. "I want to go to Derek's office," I said, surprising myself with the decision. I need to know if he was involved in this or if it was all Vanessa. My father studied my face for a moment. "Are you sure you're ready for that conversation?" "I'm ready to stop being afraid of the truth." Derek's architectural firm occupied the ground floor of a renovated warehouse in the Pearl District, all exposed brick and industrial lighting designed to look creative and cutting-edge. I'd been there countless times during our marriage, bringing him lunch or attending office parties where I'd smile politely while his colleagues talked about projects I wasn't allowed to have opinions about. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire who'd always been friendly to me, looked genuinely surprised when I walked in. "Amanda, I didn't expect to see you here. How are you holding up?" I'm doing well, thanks. Is Derek available? I need to speak with him about something important. Claire glanced toward Derek's office, where I could see him through the glass walls, bent over his drafting table with the same focused intensity he'd brought to everything except our marriage. He's between meetings right now. Let me check if he's free. She picked up her phone and spoke quietly, then nodded toward his office. He'll see you now. Derek looked up as I approached his office door, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness to something that might have been guilt. He was wearing one of the expensive button-down shirts I used to iron for him, back when I thought taking care of his needs was the same thing as being loved. Amanda, he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk, this is unexpected. I'm sure it. I remained standing, not wanting to settle into the dynamics of sitting across from him like a subordinate. I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Okay, he said slowly, setting down his pencil and giving me his full attention for what felt like the first time in years. Did you know what Vanessa was planning to do with my divorce settlement? The question hung in the air between us while Derek's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like panic. What do you mean? What she was planning to do? Derek, she stole $850,000 from me using forged medical records that claimed I was mentally unstable. Either you knew about it, or your sister is even more dangerous than I thought. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on his desk in the same way he used to sit when he was trying to figure out how to blame me for something that wasn't my fault. I knew she was concerned about you, he said fine. After the settlement was finalized, she mentioned that you seemed overwhelmed, and maybe needed help managing such a large amount of money. Concerned about me, I repeated, my voice flat. The same way you were concerned about me when you convinced me to give up my art career because it was impractical. Amanda, that's not fair. What's not fair is your sister stealing my entire future while you both pretended it was for my own good. I pulled out my phone and played a portion of Vanessa's recorded conversation with Marcus Williams, watching Derek's face grow pale as he heard his sister's voice describing my supposed mental instability. Jesus, he whispered when the recording ended. I had no idea she was saying things like that, but you knew she was involved in my finances somehow. Derek ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years of watching him struggle with decisions he didn't want to make. She said she was helping you set up investment accounts. She made it sound like you'd asked to help because you were feeling overwhelmed by the whole process, and it never occurred to you to ask me directly. We weren't exactly on speaking terms, Amanda. After everything that happened during the divorce, I figured if you wanted my input, you'd ask for it. I stared at him, trying to decide whether he was lying or just willfully naive. Derek, your sister forged medical records claiming I was mentally ill. She convinced an investment advisor that I was too unstable to manage my own money. She stole everything I was supposed to get from our divorce, and you're telling me you thought she was just being helpful? I thought. He stopped, shook his head, started again. I thought maybe she was trying to make amends for taking my side during the divorce. She felt guilty about some of the things she'd said about you, and I figured helping you with financial planning was her way of apologizing. What things had she said about me? Derek's face flushed slightly. Just family stuff. You know how Vanessa can be when she gets protective of people she cares about. No, Derek, I don't know how Vanessa can be. Tell me exactly what she said. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She thought you were manipulative, that you'd convinced me to give you more than you deserved in the settlement, by playing the victim. She said you were good at making people feel sorry for you to get what you wanted. The words hit me like ice water. Even during our divorce, when I'd thought Vanessa was supporting me, she'd been poisoning Derek against me, reinforcing every cruel thing he'd ever said about my character. And you believed her? I was angry, Amanda. I felt like you'd walked away with half of everything I'd worked for while contributing nothing to the business or our financial security. Vanessa was telling me what I wanted to hear, that I was a manipulative gold digger who deserved nothing. That's not what I said, but it's what you thought. I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. You and Vanessa spent years making me feel like I was the problem in our marriage, like my dreams were unrealistic, my emotions were excessive, my needs were unreasonable, and when I finally got the courage to leave and fight for a fair settlement, She convinced you that even that was manipulation. Derek was staring at his hands now, unable to meet my eye. I know I wasn't a good husband to you. I know I said things I shouldn't have said, and made you feel like your opinions didn't matter. But Amanda, I never wanted you to be hurt like this. If I'd known what Vanessa was really planning, you would have what? Stopped her, or just made sure you got a cut. That's not fair. What's not fair is spending 3 years of my life married to someone who thought so little of me that he believed his sister's lies without question. I turned toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Derek, I got my money back. All of it. Your sister's manipulation didn't work, and now she's going to face the consequences of fraud charges and identity theft. Amanda, wait, but I was already walking away past Claire's concerned expression, through the lobby with its carefully curated aesthetic of creative success, and out into the Portland afternoon, where the air felt cleaner than it had in years. My father was waiting in his car outside the building, and I slid into the passenger seat, feeling emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. How did it go? He asked. He knew enough to stop her but not enough to care, I said, which tells me everything I need to know about both of them. My father started the car and pulled into traffic. Where would you like to go now? Home, I said, then corrected myself. Actually, I want to look at studio spaces, real ones, not the fantasy version I'd been dreaming about. I want to see what $850,000 can actually buy me. We spent the rest of the afternoon touring converted warehouses and commercial spaces throughout the city, each one offering different possibilities for the art studio I'd dreamed about for so long. In the Alberta Arts District, we found a space with north-facing windows and enough room for both a working studio and a small gallery. The rent was reasonable, the location was perfect, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about my future. This one, I told the leasing agent, an energetic woman named Patricia, who'd been showing us properties for 2 hours. I want to put in an application. As we filled out paperwork in Patricia's office, my phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen, and I showed it to my father. Answer it, he said. Put it on speaker. I accepted the call and immediately heard Vanessa's voice, higher and more strained than I'd ever heard it before. Amanda, thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you all day. Something terrible has happened with your investment account. What kind of terrible thing? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Marcus Williams called me this morning, saying there were irregularities with the paperwork and that federal investigators might be involved. He liquidated everything without authorization, and said something about returning money to you directly. Amanda, I think he's trying to steal from both of us. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was trying to position herself as my ally, and Marcus as the villain. Vanessa, I said calmly, I know everything. The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? I mean, I know you forged medical records claiming I was mentally ill. I know you convinced Marcus Williams that I was too unstable to manage my own money.
In suburban Phoenix, 43-year-old Sarah Mitchell discovered an old photograph that would unravel her entire reality. What began as spring cleaning became a journey into her past when she noticed something impossible in the background. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced déjà vu. I know you planned this theft weeks before my divorce was even finalized. Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. No more pretense of concern or confusion, just cold calculation. You can't prove anything, Amanda. It's your word against mine, and frankly, after your behavior during the divorce, who's going to believe the bitter ex-wife over the concerned family member? Actually, I said, I can prove everything. I have recordings of your conversations with Marcus where you describe my supposed mental illness in detail. I have copies of the forged medical records you created. I have bank records showing the unauthorized transfer, and I have a very expensive lawyer who specializes in financial fraud. The silence. This time was different, deeper, more desperate. Amanda, please, let me explain. The divorce left you so vulnerable, and I was genuinely worried about what you might do with such a large amount of money. The art studio idea seemed so risky, and I thought if I could invest the money properly, grow it over time, You'd thank me later when you realized how much I'd helped you. Stop, I interrupted. Just stop. You didn't steal my money to help. You stole it because you're exactly the kind of person who believes she has the right to control other people's lives. Just like Derek convinced me I was too emotional to have opinions about our marriage, you convinced Marcus I was too unstable to manage my own finance. That's not true. It is true. And here's what's going to happen next. You're going to return every penny you spent from my account on yourself. And yes, I know there were withdrawals beyond the investment transfer. You're going to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation that's already underway. And you're going to stay away from me for the rest of your life. And if I don't, my father leaned closer to the phone, then you'll be explaining your actions to a federal judge instead of negotiating with family. Your choice, Vanessa. The call ended without another word from her, leaving my father and me sitting in Patricia's office while the leasing agent pretended she hadn't just overheard a conversation about investment fraud and FBI investigation. Well, Patricia said cheerfully, handing me a set of keys. Congratulations on your new studio space. I have a feeling you're going to do amazing things here. That evening, I stood in my new studio space as the sun set through those perfect north-facing windows, painting the empty room in shades of gold and amber. The space smelled like sawdust and possibility, like fresh starts and second chance. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not Derek's wife, not Vanessa's victim, just Amanda Reynolds with $850,000 and the rest of her life ahead of her. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. FBI wants to meet tomorrow at 10. Catherine will be there. Time to make sure Vanessa faces real consequences for what she did. I typed back, ready, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I truly was. The FBI field office in downtown Portland occupied an unremarkable building that I'd walked past hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Today, knowing I was about to sit down with federal agents to discuss the systematic theft of my life savings, the building seemed to loom larger against the gray morning sky. My father met me in the parking garage, carrying a briefcase that contained copies of every document we'd gathered over the past week. Remember, he said as we walked toward the elevator, stick to the facts. Don't let emotion cloud your testimony. These agents have seen every type of financial fraud imaginable, so be precise and thorough. Catherine was waiting for us in the lobby, dressed in her most serious suit and carrying what appeared to be half her law library in an oversized briefcase. The lead investigator is Special Agent Sarah Martinez, she explained as we signed in at the security desk. She's handled several high-profile investment fraud cases in the region. Very thorough, very professional. Agent Martinez turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every lie people could tell and wasn't impressed by any of them. Her handshake was firm, her office was Spartanly organized, and she got straight to business without the usual pleasantries. Reynolds, I've reviewed the initial complaint you filed, and I have to say, this case has some unusual elements that make it particularly interesting from an investigative standpoint. She gestured for us to sit around a small conference table that dominated one corner of her office. Financial fraud is common, but the level of identity manipulation your sister-in-law engaged in suggests a more sophisticated criminal mindset. What do you mean by identity manipulation? The forged medical records, the false psychiatric evaluations, the creation of an entirely fictional narrative about your mental state. These aren't the tools of someone who decided to steal money impulsively. This was planned, executed, and sustained over several weeks with remarkable attention to detail. Agent Martinez opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. We've subpoenaed records from Portland Mental Health Associates, the clinic, whose letterhead was used for the forged documents. Not only have you never been a patient there, but the doctor whose signature appears on your supposed psychiatric evaluation left the practice 8 months ago. So Vanessa specifically chose a doctor who wouldn't be available to verify the documents, Catherine observed. Exactly. Which suggests she researched the clinic's staff changes before deciding how to fabricate your medical history. This wasn't random, it was calculated. I stared at the forged documents, still struggling to process the level of premeditation they represented.
How did she even know how to create convincing medical records? The formatting, the terminology, everything looks professional. That's one of the things we're investigating, Agent Martinez replied. Creating medical forgeries this sophisticated requires either specialized knowledge or access to someone who has that knowledge. We're looking into whether Vanessa had accomplices in the healthcare or administrative field. The thought that there might be other people involved in stealing my money made my stomach turn. You think there are other victims? It's possible. Fraud schemes this elaborate are rarely one-time events. If Vanessa was willing to go this far to steal from a family member, she may have targeted other people using similar methods. My father leaned forward in his chair. Agent Martinez, what kind of charges is Vanessa likely to face if you can prove these allegations? Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery of federal documents, conspiracy if we find evidence of accomplices. We're looking at potential federal charges that could result in decades of prison time. The financial threshold alone triggers federal jurisdiction, but the identity theft elevates this to a much more serious level. Agent Martinez pulled out a digital recorder and placed it on the table between us. I'd like to walk through the timeline of events in detail, starting with when Vanessa first offered to help you with banking after your divorce settlement. Take your time, and don't worry about including details that seem minor. Often the smallest observations help us build the strongest case. For the next 2 hours, I recounted every interaction I'd had with Vanessa since my divorce proceedings began. Agent Martinez asked precise questions about dates, locations, who else was present during various conversations, and exactly what documents Vanessa had access to at different points in the timeline. When you opened the investment account at Chase Bank, did Vanessa handle any of the paperwork directly? Agent Martinez asked. She helped me fill out some of the forms and she took photos of everything with her phone. She said she wanted to help me organize all the account information in a spreadsheet. Did she have access to your phone or computer during this period? I thought back to the countless hours Vanessa had spent at my apartment during those stressful weeks. She borrowed my laptop a few times to help research investment options, and she had my phone occasionally when I was too emotional to deal with calls from lawyers or the bank. Agent Martinez made notes on her legal path. Access to your devices would explain how she obtained detailed personal information for the forged medical records. Your insurance information, emergency contacts, even your social security number, all of that would be accessible through email accounts or stored documents. The realization that Vanessa had violated my privacy so thoroughly while pretending to comfort me made me feel sick. She was collecting information to use against me while I was crying on her shoulder about Derek's emotional abuse. I'm sorry you had to experience that level of betrayal, Agent Martinez said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. But I want you to know that your detailed recollection of events is going to be crucial in building a case that ensures she faces appropriate consequence. Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Agent Martinez, we also have audio recordings of Vanessa's conversations with the financial advisor where she details Amanda's supposed mental health issues. These might be useful for establishing criminal intent. Absolutely. Recorded conversations where she knowingly makes false statements to facilitate fraud are some of the strongest evidence we can have. Agent Martinez accepted the folder and began reviewing the content. This level of documentation is unusual. Most fraud victims don't have such comprehensive records of the crime as it was being committed. That's thanks to Amanda's father, Catherine said. His business experience taught him to approach this systematically rather than emotionally. My father cleared his throat. Agent Martinez, I have a question about the investigation timeline. How long before you're able to arrest Vanessa and formally charge her with these crimes? That depends on several factors. We need to complete our analysis of the forged documents, interview Marcus Williams formally, and determine whether there are additional victims or accomplices. I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks for the investigation phase, assuming Vanessa doesn't attempt to flee or destroy evidence. What's to stop her from leaving the country? I asked, suddenly worried that Vanessa might disappear before facing justice. We've already flagged her passport and placed monitoring on her financial account. If she attempts to leave the jurisdiction or move large amounts of money, we'll know immediately. Agent Martinez closed the folder and looked directly at me. Reynolds, I want you to understand that federal fraud cases like this have a very high conviction rate when we have evidence this strong. Vanessa Reynolds is going to face serious consequences for what she did to you. As we prepared to leave, Agent Martinez handed me her business card. I may need to contact you for additional questions as the investigation progresses, and if Vanessa attempts to contact you directly, please let me know immediately. People facing federal charges sometimes make poor decisions about witness intimidation. Walking out of the FBI building, I felt a strange combination of relief and anxiety. The legal machinery was now in motion to ensure Vanessa faced justice. But that also meant the most difficult parts of this experience were still ahead. Testifying in federal court, reliving the betrayal in front of strangers, watching someone I'd once considered family be sentenced to prison. None of it would be easy. How are you feeling? My father asked as we stood in the parking garage. Like I'm finally fighting back instead of just surviving, I said, but also scared about what comes next. That's normal, Catherine assured me. Federal cases can be emotionally draining, but they're also thorough. By the time this goes to trial, there won't be any doubt about Vanessa's guilt or the severity of her crimes. We were interrupted by my phone ringing. The caller ID showed my apartment building's management office, which was unusual since I'd never had any issues that required their attention. Miss Reynolds? This is Janet from Riverside Apartments. I'm calling because someone was here earlier asking about you, and frankly, their behavior was concerning enough that I wanted to let you know. My blood went cold. What kind of behavior? A woman claiming to be your sister said she needed to check on your welfare because you'd been having mental health issues. She wanted access to your apartment and seemed very insistent when I explained that we couldn't allow that without your permission. She became quite agitated and started making claims about your psychological state that honestly sounded like she was describing someone else entirely. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar dread that had become my constant companion since this nightmare began. What did she look like? Mid-30s, auburn hair, expensive clothing. She had identification with the last name Reynolds and claimed you'd asked her to collect some personal items because you were in psychiatric care. That was my ex-sister-in-law, and everything she told you was a lie. I'm perfectly fine, I'm not in any kind of care, and she absolutely does not have permission to access my apartment. I figured as much, which is why I refused her request and asked her to leave the property. But Miss Reynolds, she seemed to know quite a bit about your personal life, your work schedule, your recent divorce, even details about your apartment layout. It was unsettling. The thought of Vanessa trying to gain access to my home, possibly to plant evidence or steal documents that could help her defense, made me furious. Janet, I need you to add a note to my file that under no circumstances should anyone be given access to my apartment without my explicit written permission. And if she comes back, please call the police immediately. Of course, I'll also alert our security company to be extra vigilant about unauthorized visitors. After ending the call, I immediately contacted Agent Martinez to report Vanessa's attempt to access my apartment. Her response was swift and decisive. This is exactly the kind of poor decision-making I was concerned about, she said. Attempting to impersonate mental health professionals and gain unauthorized access to your residence could add additional charges to her case. I'm going to request immediate surveillance on her activity. The rest of the day passed in a blur of security consultations and apartment building meetings. I installed additional locks on my door, gave the building management detailed photos of Vanessa with instructions to call police if she returned, and arranged for a security system that would alert me to any unauthorized entry attempt. That evening, I sat in my new art studio space, with a cup of tea and my first canvas in over 3 years. The familiar weight of a paintbrush in my hand felt like reconnecting with a lost part of myself. I'd spent so many years being told my art was impractical, unrealistic, a waste of time and money. Now, painting in a space I'd paid for with my own money, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with creating in the first place. I was mixing colors on my palette when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Amanda, this is getting out of hand. Federal agents came to my apartment today. We need to talk before this goes too far. I can explain everything if you'll just give me a chance. I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Agent Martinez before responding. The only explanation I'm interested in hearing is the one you give to a federal judge. The reply came quickly. You're making a huge mistake. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Drop the charges now and we can work something out privately. This message I also forwarded to Agent Martinez, along with a note, "This sounds like intimidation to me." Her response was immediate. "Absolutely, it is. We're moving up our timeline for arrest. Expect news within 48 hours." I set my phone aside and returned to my painting, finding peace in the simple act of applying color to canvas. Tomorrow would bring more complications, more legal procedures, more reminders of the betrayal I'd experienced. But tonight, in my own space with my own art supplies bought with my own money, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete independence. The next morning brought news that Vanessa had been arrested at her apartment on federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. According to Agent Martinez, she'd been taken into custody without incident, but had immediately requested a lawyer and refused to make any statements about the charges. Her attorney is going to try to negotiate a plea deal, Agent Martinez explained during our phone conversation. But given the evidence we have and the additional charges from her attempted intimidation, the prosecution isn't likely to offer anything particularly generous. What does that mean for me? It means you should prepare for a trial. Vanessa's lawyer may advise her to plead guilty to avoid the maximum penalties, but defendants facing significant prison time often choose to fight the charges rather than accept responsibility. The prospect of testifying in federal court was daunting, but I found myself looking forward to the opportunity to tell my story in full. For too many years I'd been silenced by Derek's dismissiveness and Vanessa's manipulation. The idea of speaking my truth in a courtroom where lies would be challenged and facts would matter felt like the ultimate vindication. That afternoon I received an unexpected visitor at my studio. Derek appeared at my door looking haggard and uncomfortable, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him there. "Amanda, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Vanessa was arrested this morning." "I know. Did you know the FBI also wants to interview me? They think I might have been involved in planning the theft." I continued painting, not bothering to look at him. "Were you?" "Of course not. How can you even ask that?" "Because your sister didn't act in a vacuum." She knew details about my personal life, my insurance information, my schedule, my emotional state during the divorce. Either you helped her gather that information, or you're even more oblivious than I thought. Derek was quiet for a long moment, studying the painting I was working on, an abstract piece in blues and greens that somehow captured the feeling of emerging from deep water into sunlight. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said finally. "When Vanessa said she was concerned about your mental state, I thought she was being genuinely caring. When she offered to help you with financial planning, I thought maybe she was trying to make up for being so critical of you during our marriage. But you never bothered to ask me directly what I wanted or needed. We weren't speaking, Amanda. After the way our divorce ended, I figured you'd rather handle things without my input." I finally turned to face Derek. "Your sister stole $850,000 from me using forged medical records that claimed I was mentally ill. She spent weeks planning this theft while pretending to comfort me about your emotional abuse. And your first concern is whether you might get in trouble with the FBI.
That's not my first concern. Then what is?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen thousands of times during our marriage when he was trying to avoid taking responsibility for something. "I'm worried about you. This whole federal case, the media attention it might bring, the stress of testifying in court. Are you sure you want to put yourself through all of that?" I stared at him, amazed that even now, even after everything that had happened, he was trying to convince me that seeking justice was somehow bad for me. "Derek," I said calmly, "your concern for my well-being is about 3 years too late. What I want now is for your sister to face the consequences of her crimes, and for everyone who enabled her, including people who should have asked questions but didn't, to understand that there are real costs to looking the other way when someone is being victimized. So you're going to testify against her." "I'm going to tell the truth about what she did to me. If that's testifying against her, then yes." Derek nodded slowly, then turned toward the door. "For what it's worth, Amanda, I'm sorry about the marriage, about not protecting you from Vanessa's manipulation, about all of it." "I know you are," I said, returning to my paint. "But sorry doesn't give me back the 3 years I spent doubting my own judgment, because you convinced me I was too mum to have valid opinions about my own life." After he left, I stood in my studio surrounded by canvases and art supplies in natural light, feeling more like myself than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring more legal proceedings, more questions about the theft, more reminders of how thoroughly I'd been betrayed by people I'd trusted. But I was no longer the woman who'd sat silent while others made decisions about her life. I was someone who'd fought back, reclaimed her money, and built something beautiful from the ashes of deception. My phone buzzed with a message from Agent Martinez. Trial date set for 6 weeks from today. Are you ready? I typed back without hesitation. Ready. The morning of the trial arrived with crisp autumn air and the kind of clear skies that made Portland look like a postcard. I'd spent the previous evening in my studio, finishing a painting I'd started weeks earlier, a piece that began dark and chaotic, but gradually evolved into something that captured light breaking through storm clouds. Looking at it now, I realized it perfectly represented my journey from victim to survivor. Catherine picked me up at 8 sharp, her usual professional composure enhanced by what I'd come to recognize as her courtroom energy. "Remember everything we discussed during prep," she said as we drove toward the federal courthouse. "Answer only the questions asked, speak clearly and directly, and don't let the defense attorney rattle you with aggressive cross-examination tactics." The federal courthouse was an imposing building that commanded respect through its classical architecture and the weight of justice it represented. As we walked through security and rode the elevator to the trial floor, I felt a calm determination settle over me. This was my chance to tell the complete truth about what Vanessa had done, and I was ready. Agent Martinez met us outside the courtroom, carrying a briefcase filled with evidence that would support my testimony. "The prosecution team is confident," she said. "Vanessa's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal yesterday, but she refused to accept responsibility for the full scope of her crimes. She's going to claim that she genuinely believed she was helping you, even with all the forged documents and recorded conversation. Her lawyer is arguing that she was misguided but not malicious, that family concern drove her to make poor decisions rather than criminal intent. It's a weak defense, but it's all they have." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected but filled with an atmosphere of serious purpose. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she'd seen every type of case imaginable and wouldn't tolerate theatrics from either side. The jury box held 12 people whose faces revealed nothing about their thoughts or opinions. Vanessa sat at the defense table wearing a conservative blue suit that made her look like a concerned professional rather than a criminal defendant. Her attorney, a thin man named Robert Clemens, had positioned himself to partially block the jury's view of his client, a subtle psychological tactic that Catherine had warned me about. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, a woman whose reputation for thoroughness had impressed even Catherine. She outlined the case methodically, explaining how Vanessa had systematically planned and executed the theft of my divorce settlement, through identity fraud and financial manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Santos said, "this case is about more than theft. It's about the calculated destruction of trust between family members, the creation of elaborate lies to justify criminal behavior, and the complete violation of someone's financial autonomy based on fabricated concerns about their mental health." Santos walked the jury through the timeline of Vanessa's crimes, from her initial offer to help with banking to the creation of forged medical records, to her recorded conversations with Marcus Williams, describing my supposed psychological instability. Each piece of evidence was presented clearly and connected to the larger pattern of deliberate deception. "The defendant didn't steal Amanda Reynolds' money impulsively," Santos continued. "She planned this theft for weeks, researching medical terminology, studying clinic procedures, and carefully constructing a false narrative that would justify taking control of someone else's financial future. This was fraud at the highest level, executed with precision and sustained through continuous lies." Defense attorney Clemens attempted to reframe Vanessa's actions as misguided family concern rather than criminal behavior. His opening statement portrayed her as someone who genuinely believed I was emotionally fragile and needed financial protection, even if her methods were legally questionable. "Vanessa Reynolds is guilty of making poor decisions," Clemens told the jury. "She's guilty of overstepping boundaries and using questionable judgment, but she's not guilty of criminal intent to defraud her sister-in-law. Every action she took was motivated by genuine concern for Amanda's well-being during a difficult divorce."
I found his argument insulting in its assumption that the jury would believe such obvious manipulation. But Catherine had warned me that defense attorneys often rely on creating doubt rather than proving innocent. When Santos called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand feeling more confident than I'd expected. This was my opportunity to speak my truth in a forum where lies would be challenged and facts would matter. I'd spent years being silenced by Derek's dismissiveness and Vanessa's manipulation, and now I finally had a platform where my voice carried legal weight. Santos guided me through my testimony methodically, starting with my marriage to Derek and the emotional dynamics that had made me vulnerable to Vanessa's manipulation. I described how Derek had systematically undermined my confidence and dismissed my dreams, creating the psychological foundation that Vanessa later exploited. During your divorce proceedings, how would you describe your relationship with Vanessa Reynolds, Santos? I thought she was my ally, I answered, my voice steady and clear. She presented herself as someone who understood what I was going through, who supported my decision to leave Derek and who wanted to help me build a new life. I trusted her completely. Did you ever give Vanessa Reynolds permission to access your banking information or make financial decisions on your behalf? Absolutely not. She was present when I opened accounts because she offered to help me navigate the banking process, but I never authorized her to control my money or speak for me with financial advisor. Santos introduced the forged medical records into evidence, asking me to review them and confirm that I'd never been a patient at Portland Mental Health Associates or received any of the treatments described in the fabricated document. These records claim that you were suffering from severe depression and financial decision-making impairment, Santos said. Is any of that true? None of it is true. I was emotionally exhausted from the divorce, but I was not mentally ill or incapable of managing my own finances. The psychological evaluation described in these documents never happened, and the recommendations for financial oversight were completely fabricated. When Santos played recordings of Vanessa's conversations with Marcus Williams, I listened to my sister-in-law describe my supposed mental instability with clinical detachment, as if discussing a case study rather than a human being she claimed to care about. How did it feel to hear Vanessa Reynolds describe you in those terms to a financial advisor? Santos asked. It felt like a complete betrayal of everything I'd shared with her during the most vulnerable period of my life. She took my fears, my insecurities, and my private struggles and twisted them into a weapon to justify stealing my future. The cross-examination was more aggressive, as Catherine had predicted. Clemens tried to portray me as vindictive and unstable, someone whose anger about the divorce had clouded my judgment about Vanessa's intentions. Ms. Reynolds, isn't it true that you were extremely emotional and making impulsive decisions during your divorce proceedings? He asked. I was emotional because I was ending a marriage to someone who had spent 3 years making me feel worthless. I replied calmly. But being emotional doesn't mean being incompetent or mentally ill. But you did rely heavily on Vanessa for emotional support during this period, didn't you? Yes, because I believed she cared about me. I didn't realize she was using my vulnerability to plan a crime. Clemens tried to suggest that I'd been irresponsible with money in the past, that my dreams of opening an art studio were unrealistic, and that Vanessa's concerns about my financial judgment might have been legitimate even if her methods were wrong. Mr. Clemens, I said, looking directly at the jury, there is no legitimate concern that justifies forging medical records, lying to financial advisors, and stealing someone's divorce settlement. Vanessa didn't steal my money because she was worried about my art studio. She stole it because she believed she had the right to control my life. When Marcus Williams testified, his discomfort was obvious. He admitted that he'd processed the investment without contacting me directly, relying instead on Vanessa's assurances and the forged medical documentation. In retrospect, Williams said, I should have insisted on speaking with Ms. Reynolds personally before accepting such a large investment on her behalf, but the documentation appeared legitimate, and Ms. Vanessa Reynolds was a longtime client with an established relationship with our firm. Santos pressed him on the specific claims Vanessa had made about my mental state, Did Vanessa Reynolds ever suggest that Amanda Reynolds might be dangerous to herself or others if left to manage her own finances? She implied that Ms. Reynolds might make reckless decisions that could result in financial ruin. She painted a picture of someone who was emotionally unstable and prone to impulsive behavior that could have long-term negative consequences. And you believed these characterizations without independent verification. Williams looked genuinely ashamed. I trusted a long-time client's assessment of a family situation. It was a failure of professional judgment that I deeply regret. The prosecution also called Dr. Patricia Young from Portland Mental Health Associates, who confirmed that I'd never been a patient at their clinic, and that the supposed psychiatric evaluation was completely fabricated using their letterhead and the forged signature of a doctor who'd left their practice months earlier. Creating false medical records of this sophistication requires detailed knowledge of clinical procedures and documentation standards, Dr. Young testified. This wasn't someone guessing at medical terminology. This was someone who understood how psychiatric evaluations are structured and reported. Agent Martinez testified about the investigation's findings, including evidence that Vanessa had researched the clinic's staff changes before selecting which doctor's signature to forge. This was a carefully planned crime executed with significant attention to detail, she told the jury. Every element was designed to create maximum credibility for the false narrative. When the defense called Vanessa to testify on her own behalf, I watched her take the witness stand with the same composed demeanor she'd maintained throughout the trial. Dressed conservatively and speaking in measured tones, she attempted to portray herself as a concerned family member whose good intentions had been misunderstood. I was genuinely worried about Amanda's emotional state, Vanessa testified. The divorce had been traumatic for her, and she was talking about using her settlement money for risky investments in an art studio that didn't seem financially viable. I thought if I could help her invest the money more conservatively, she'd thank me later when she realized how much I'd helped her financial security. Clemens guided her through a narrative that portrayed every criminal action as misguided concern. The forged medical records were described as documentation to help financial advisors understand Amanda's emotional state. The unauthorized investment transfers were characterized as temporary protective measures until Amanda was ready to make sound financial decisions. But Santos' cross-examination systematically destroyed this carefully constructed defense. She forced Vanessa to explain exactly how she'd obtained my personal information, why she'd chosen to forge medical records instead of seeking legitimate psychological evaluation, and why she'd never contacted me directly about her supposed concern. Reynolds, if you were genuinely concerned about Amanda's mental health, why didn't you encourage her to seek professional help rather than creating fake medical records claiming she was already receiving treatment? Vanessa struggled to answer. I thought the investment approach would be less confrontational than suggesting she needed psychiatric care, less confrontational than encouraging therapy, but more appropriate than committing multiple federal crimes. I never intended to commit crimes. I was trying to help. By lying to financial advisors about Amanda's mental state, I was concerned by forging medical documents using a real clinic's letterhead. The documentation was meant to convey by stealing $850,000 from someone you claim to care about. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. I was going to give the money back once she was in a better emotional place to handle it responsibly. When would that have been, Miss Reynolds? When you decided she was mentally stable enough to deserve her own divorce settlement. The question hung in the courtroom air like an accusation that couldn't be answered. Vanessa had revealed the fundamental arrogance underlying her crimes, the belief that she had the right to determine when I was worthy of controlling my own financial future. During closing arguments, Santos connected all the evidence into a comprehensive picture of calculated fraud designed to exploit family trust and institutional weaknesses. Vanessa Reynolds didn't steal Amanda's money because she was concerned about her welfare, Santos told the jury. She stole it because she believed she had the right to control another person's life. She created elaborate lies to justify that control, forged medical documents to give those lies credibility, and manipulated financial institutions into enabling her theft. Santos paused, looking directly at each juror. This case is about more than money. It's about the fundamental right to autonomy over your own life. Vanessa Reynolds violated that right through deception, manipulation, and criminal fraud. She must be held accountable not just for the theft, but for the systematic violation of trust that made the theft possible. Clemens made one final attempt to portray Vanessa as misguided rather than malicious, but his arguments felt hollow after the weight of evidence Santos had presented. My client made mistakes, he admitted. She used poor judgment and crossed legal boundaries, but criminal intent requires malicious purpose, and everything Vanessa Reynolds did was motivated by genuine concern for her sister-in-law's well-being. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict. When the foreman stood to deliver their decision, the courtroom fell completely silent. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery of federal documents, we find the defendant guilty. Each guilty verdict hit like a hammer blow of justice. I felt Catherine squeeze my hand as the verdicts continued, encompassing every charge the prosecution had brought. When the foreman finished, Vanessa was sitting with her head in her hands while her attorney stared at the table in defeat. Judge Hernandez scheduled sentencing for the following month, explaining that federal guidelines for the combined charges carried a potential penalty of 15 to 20 years in prison. Vanessa was remanded to federal custody pending sentencing, her bail revoked due to flight risk concern. As we left the courthouse, I felt a profound sense of completion. The legal system had validated my experience, confirmed that what happened to me was indeed criminal, and ensured that Vanessa would face serious consequences for her actions. How do you feel? Catherine asked as we stood on the courthouse steps, watching ordinary life continue around us while we'd just concluded an extraordinary legal victory. Free, I said, and meant it completely. Agent Martinez joined us, carrying the briefcase that had held all the evidence of Vanessa's crime. The restitution order will ensure you receive compensation for all legal fees and costs associated with the case, she said. And Amanda, I want you to know that your testimony was some of the strongest I've heard in 20 years of investigating financial fraud. That evening, I returned to my studio and stood in front of the painting I'd completed that morning. The storm clouds were still there, but they no longer dominated the canvas. Instead, light poured through them in streams of gold and silver, transforming the darkness into something beautiful and powerful. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Proud of you. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate? I typed back yes, and Dad, thank you for believing in me. His response was immediate. I've always believed in you. I'm just glad you believe in yourself now too. 3 weeks later, Vanessa was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. She made no statement at sentencing, showing no remorse for the crimes that had devastated my life and violated the trust of everyone who'd tried to help her. Judge Hernandez's comments during sentencing echoed much of what I'd felt throughout the ordeal. Financial fraud is serious enough when it targets strangers, the judge said, but when it exploits family relationships and involves the systematic creation of false medical records to justify theft, it represents a particularly egregious violation of trust that demands significant consequences. Derek sent me a letter after the sentencing, a rambling apology that attempted to distance himself from his sister's crimes while asking for forgiveness for his own role in making me vulnerable to her manipulation. I read it once, then threw it away without responding. Some chapters of your life deserve to be closed completely. 6 months after the trial, my art studio was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined. The gallery space hosted monthly exhibitions featuring local artists, and I was teaching workshops for people who'd lost touch with their creative sides during difficult life transitions. Many of my students were women recovering from divorce or other major life changes, and I found deep satisfaction in helping them reconnect with parts of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. The painting I'd completed the morning of the trial hung in the gallery's main room, titled After the Storm. People often stopped to study it, drawn to the way light transformed darkness into something beautiful rather than simply overcoming it. On the anniversary of my divorce being finalized, I stood in my studio surrounded by canvases, art supplies, and natural light, feeling more like myself than I had in years. The $850,000 had been returned in full, plus additional compensation for legal costs and emotional damages. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed something that no amount of money could buy: confidence in my own judgment and the strength to protect myself from people who tried to control my life. My phone rang, and I saw my father's name on the screen. "How are you doing today?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd watched me transform from victim to survivor. "I'm painting," I said, looking at the canvas I'd started that morning, another piece exploring the interplay between light and shadow. "And I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "I'm proud of you, Amanda, not just for surviving what Vanessa did, but for building something beautiful from it." After we hung up, I returned to my painting, losing myself in the simple joy of creating something that hadn't existed before. The woman who'd sat in that law office a year ago, terrified and betrayed, and convinced she'd never recover from such devastating manipulation, felt like someone from another lifetime. I was no longer Derek's wife or Vanessa's victim. I was Amanda Reynolds, artist and business owner, someone who'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger rather than broken. The art studio around me wasn't just a business, it was proof that dreams deferred aren't dreams destroyed, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of your life begin after the worst ones end. The afternoon light streaming through my north-facing windows painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. I picked up my brush and continued painting, creating something new from my own vision and my own choices, answerable to no one but myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.